Welcome to Doc Secret, the show where we uncover the playbooks, strategies, and stories behind the most successful dental and medical practice owners and the companies that serve them. This show is all about building the best practice. Whether you're a dental or medical student dreaming of private practice, a seasoned doctor looking to grow or sell, or an investor exploring the healthcare space, this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Kevin Carl, and in today's episode, we're diving into the world of group practices, mergers and acquisition, the future of the dental industry, and the leadership required to navigate these future uncharted waters. Let's get started. Welcome to Doc Secret. Joining me today is Perrin DesPortes. Perrin's career spans 30 years in the business side of the dental industry. Perrin is the founder of the Next Level Executive. He's a Washington and Lee University graduate and earned his MBA at the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. Perrin has run 3 different business units for Patterson Dental Supply over a 15-year career. And for the past decade, he has built and exited 2 very successful startups in the form of Tusk Partners and Polaris Healthcare Partners, both of which focus in the group practice consulting and transactional space. In his current endeavor with the Next Level Executive, Perrin combines his decades of experience working in corporate America and consulting directly with healthcare entrepreneurs on their growth journey, all distilled into actionable content and practical wisdom. Perrin is happily married with an 11-year-old daughter at home, and in his spare time, he's an avid cyclist, enjoys cooking and reading, and loves good red wine and strong coffee. Perrin, welcome to the program.
Wow, Kev, that was I almost like the guy you described there, you know? I mean, it sounds pretty good. No, I don't, in all seriousness, I've been looking forward to this conversation with you, and I think we're going to go in a lot of different directions at hopefully a high degree of depth. So this ought to be a lot of fun. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining me, Perrin. I know we've been talking about this for a while. I'm glad we finally got our act together and made it happen. Well, let's start with your story and give some context for our audience. You are a 4th-generation dental industry professional. Did you face expectations of entering the family business, and when did you internalize that this space would be your calling?
Yeah, so my background is, I guess you could say I was born into it. Sometimes I think it's a little bit like being in the mafia at times, but I learned a lot about business from the knee of my father, and sometimes at the dinner table, in all actuality. And when I graduated from W&L and had a little bit of experience for a few years after that, I did come back into the family business. My father was president and CEO at the time. This was late 1995, I guess. And my grandfather was chairman of the board. And, you know, I wouldn't say that my dad or my family ever mandated that I do so, but it was a good opportunity. It was a growing company, and was going to be an opportunity for me to kind of cut my teeth. And I was fortunate that when I entered into the business, I pursued a path that neither my father nor my grandfather had pursued when they entered the business in their first years. And so I got to be, I'll say, my own person, not just the boss's son. And sometimes, you know, when in our early phases of our career, we all struggle for accomplishment and differentiating ourselves from our peers and things like that. And when you have the weight of family expectations on you, that can be, I'll just say, it can be challenging. What family business looks like to a lot of people from the outside looking in looks dramatically different being within the family and looking outside of it. And my father did say early on in my career that, you know, he was grateful to have me in the business, having that I had entered into the business, because from a leadership standpoint, when you're leading a family business, you have to make decisions for the business, but also from a family perspective. And that's a very heady weight of responsibility for somebody who's not a family member to have to bear. So not to say that I was set up to ever be CEO or that it would have inevitably been that, but it was something I started to learn early on. And I always say that I wish I had a little bit more time in working for my father. But at the same time, I'm incredibly grateful for my, decade and a half with Patterson, and we can talk more about that too.
Yeah, I'd love to dig into that. I know you rose through the ranks quickly, and that's not a testament to lineage. That's a testament to your capability, sacrifice, and hard work. But also to your openness to learning. And you've talked about mentorship being pivotal. Could you share maybe one mentor's influence that changed your trajectory in the early part of your career?
Yeah, and this is something that, with all candor, this is something that I've only really realized in the last, I'd say, maybe decade of my career, or really grown to appreciate. And if it's one bit of advice I might give your audience, if they're in if they're in dental school or if they're in medical school or just entering the workforce, it's to chase mentors, not money. And we all want to be compensated for what we do, and there's nothing wrong with that. But what you find is that somebody who's willing to take you under their wing and share or impart their experiential wisdom to you is an accelerant to your career and to your earning capabilities in rapid fashion. And I am the beneficiary of that, and I am grateful for it almost on a daily basis when I was never bright enough or self-aware enough to actually be proactive and ask for it early on. Somebody saw something in me that I didn't realize I had, and I was the beneficiary of their time and efforts. And I wish I could say that it was me seeking them, but it was fortunately them finding me. I think the two people I would point to in my early career, late stage with Thompson Dental Company, the family business, was a guy named Randy Eckerd who asked me to relocate from my hometown, Columbia, South Carolina, where I was born and raised and living at the time, to uproot myself and extricate myself from out from under my father's shadow and move to Raleigh, North Carolina, to lead a technology sales group that was in the early stages of the what we now know as the electronic medical record phase. But back then, it was still paper charts and pegboards and ledger systems and all that kind of not so glamorous stuff. But made a name for myself in doing that, and also kind of pioneered a new concept within the company that arguably I might never have had the opportunity to do if he hadn't, pulled me into the Raleigh branch and really gave me some creative space and liberties to pioneer that effort. And Randy, when we elected to sell the business to Patterson in April of 2002, Randy became a regional manager for Patterson. He was vice president of sales and marketing for Thompson. So went into a regional capacity at Patterson and really looked out for me, uh, not just being the boss's son, the former boss's son, but somebody who would be capable of running a true operation at Patterson. And it took a little while. I'm not going to say that I landed a job quickly. I ended up raising my hand for multiple jobs, got passed over for them, and thought I was not going to have a home within the company until finally, after about 90 days, the Richmond, Virginia branch had literally imploded after the acquisition, and was a complete mess. And the leadership at Patterson couldn't find anybody to take that job. So I think the theory was, well, you know, the business can't be screwed up any more than it already is. Let's give Perrin a shot, right? And like Bob Dylan says, if you got nothing, you got nothing left to lose. So I needed the opportunity, and they needed somebody stupid enough to take it. And it was it wasn't a marriage made in heaven. When I got there, the word on the street was, well, we bought the old man's company, or they bought the old man's company, and we inherited the kid. So that's kind of a tough way to start your career. But Bob Foss, who is the general manager in Baltimore, the branch immediately to my north, and we shared like a border of where his branch ended and my branch geography began. Bob was a career guy at Patterson, on the podium for branch of the year, had done everything in the company, and really was, to use a mafia analogy again, a made man in the business. Took me under his wing as he saw that I was trying to correct a lot of wrongs that he had seen from afar in Richmond, some things that were unethical at a minimum, but really trying to build a culture, build a team the right way, and really make Richmond into a branch that would be more representative of what Patterson was all about. And so Bob took me under his wing and coached me through a lot of challenging scenarios with employees, with growth, with strategy, with really creating a new culture, and also kind of saved me from myself because I was determined to make a name for myself and to fix everything that was wrong in short order. And I'll never forget one day he said, "Perrin, this is a 50-hour-a-week job. Those who work 40 hours a week don't get enough done, and those who try to work 60 to 80 hours a week burn out and they don't last very long." And that was kind of that throttle your efforts back, kid, play the long game. And I think between Randy and Bob, those were two of the guys that really benefited me massively in the late stages of the Thompson Dental phase and the early stages of the Patterson phase, for sure.
Well, the past decade of your career has been fascinating and very successful. Obviously, you picked up a lot from that first decade, and we'll talk about what's in between. But could you share with us the change from, corporate America to M&A and advisory work? How did you make that transition?
Yeah, the short answer is not very well. I mean, it was it was a little bit of a bumpy landing, I'll say. I had been raised, even though it's a family business, Thompson Dental was a fairly large operation. It employed about 400 people, revenue of about $100 million in the last year, and had 14 sales branches. So it was a pretty decent sized business. And Patterson, obviously being a publicly traded NASDAQ company and true corporate America, I'm a structure guy. I mean, Perrin doesn't do anything without a plan. And so I'll say that, exiting Patterson was something that I realized in my early 40s. Um, I was running the Charlotte branch at the time and was newly married with a young daughter. I didn't, I'd been a general manager for 15 years and it was getting to be more like middle management, honestly. The company was changing a lot and it just wasn't as fulfilling or creative of a job as it was when I took it in 2002. And I didn't want to live life on an airplane as a regional manager, leave my wife and daughter behind. That's, as you can attest, a tough gig, right? And so I also wasn't going to move to Minneapolis and uproot the family. Minneapolis, St. Paul is where the company's headquartered. And,
Oh,
once you kind of make those decisions, it becomes a you problem, not a company problem, right? And so then, okay, what are you going to do about it? And I had a lot of connections in the industry, and I've, had a lot of opportunities, but a lot of them felt like, you know, lateral moves, maybe just into a different business card, right? And that wasn't really what I wanted to do. And I was even exploring possibly leaving dentistry, and a friend of mine who was a high-ranking executive for Philip Morris Altria said, "Look, you've got the chops to do whatever you want to do, Perrin, but just realize if you leave dentistry, you're leaving all your tribal knowledge, all your experience, all your contacts, all your network, and a lot of that behind. And while you can't put a dollar value on any of that, there's a lot of there. And so when Roy said that, I said, all right, well, I gotta stay in dental. So what's happening in dental at that point? And this is, 2014, 2015, 2016, this movement of consolidation of group practices and private equity backed ventures was really starting to pick up a lot of steam. And I know we'll talk about that probably more in depth too. But, when I left, it was one of those things where it took me a little while. It took me about 2 to 2.5 years to ultimately leave Patterson to kind of crystallize what it was that I wanted to pursue, who I wanted to do it with, and how I wanted to do it. And it ended up being a startup venture that was called Tusk Partners that focused on the emerging group practice space, where entrepreneurial dentists were looking to build a group practice, or if they had already built a group practice, they were looking to transact that group practice, usually to a private equity-backed venture. And so we were one of the first in the space that really not only did M&A advisory, but also did strategic consulting from a growth strategy standpoint. And we created some innovative solutions around associate equity and financial modeling and the like that really kind of put us on the map. And I like to tell people that, as much as we hate to admit it as business owners, entrepreneurs, and even executives, timing and luck counts for a lot in business, and nobody who thumps their chest likes to admit that, but it kind of is the truth. And we were at the right place at the right time. And Polaris Healthcare Partners, my second venture, was an offshoot of Tusk, doing much the same thing. But for the last 8 to 10 years, that kind of transition from corporate America into an entrepreneurial environment has been bumpy. But doing it with partners initially was beneficial for me. And now Next Level Executive is a solo venture that I've launched that is truly all about me being a solopreneur. That's a much different business, but I could have never done that directly coming out of corporate America. I wasn't a well-rounded enough entrepreneur, or a risk taker for that matter, to be able to pull that off.
Well, I'd love to talk about both of those. So we'll put a pin in the second one, the risk piece, for just
Yeah.
a second. Let's talk about that client interaction. So you come out of Patterson, you're in the advisory space, you have the ability to make a big impact on the future of a client and what happens not only with their practice, but with their livelihood and what have you. Is there a client experience that sticks out for you that's especially memorable, whether that's positive or negative, by the way? But I'd love to hear, sort of a little bit of context around what that looked like for one of your clients and for you.
Yeah, maybe it's a good question. And sometimes it's like asking a dentist about a particular patient, right? When you have worked with so many different people, sometimes it's tough to draw one out
Yeah,
that's an excessively positive experience, though
sure.
we had many on both consulting and certainly transactions. But I think sometimes the best learning experiences come from adversity or negative situations. And I'll give you a quick representation of two that are somewhat illustrative. I used to host a lot of people one-on-one sessions, day-long sessions in our Charlotte office back in the early Tusk days. And it would be somebody who would come in and want to learn about how these businesses fit together and the role of private equity and valuation and all this other kind of stuff. And I'd spend about 6 to 8 hours with them, taking them through, a one-on-one session with some pre-printed content and others just off the whiteboard. And I had one young dentist who was new into the profession, early years of his practice ownership. I think he owned one practice, if I remember correctly, in the Southwest, and was telling me that he wanted to build the next Heartland Dental, which of course is the largest player in our space now, probably, around 1,800 practices or something like that. Track record of success over multiple decades, right? And I remember talking with him, and he was serious about it. And my first thought was, why don't we go from 1 to 2 before we go from 1 to 2,000? That's just a suggestion. And then he said, well, that's fine. We'll get to 2, but I'm going to bring in private equity now. I'm not going to wait. And I said, I sort of thought to myself, okay, well, that sounds like a me tooism. Everybody else is doing it, so I'll do it too. And I asked him, I said, what is a private equity partner at this stage of your journey? What's a private equity partner going to solve for you that either debt financing or operations can't? And he didn't really understand the question. And he didn't understand the question because he didn't know the value of equity, of ownership in a business, about what he brought to the table with both his licensure, being a practitioner of the craft, and also owning the practice, where a layperson, a non-professional like you or me, Kevin, can't own charts and records. So if all you're looking for a private equity partner to do is supply funding, then you don't have an appreciation for the value of the business that you're creating. And that's a fundamental flaw in your lack of understanding about business. Or it means that you're too much of a chicken to personally guarantee debt to build a business that only you can build. Now,
Hmm.
either way, neither one of those answers are really good in my mind. And so I don't know whatever happened to the guy, but the other thing was kind of like, okay, we got young dentists now entering the profession who want to build a group to sell a group. Whatever happened to changing people's lives from an oral healthcare perspective and the reason that we went to dental or medical school in the first place? And I think that was when people start thinking about ringing the cash register prematurely, we're way off the reservation at that point. And that was kind of one of those early flares that might have gone up in my mind about, I think we've got misplaced incentives here. And I think that's intensely problematic. The second thing I'll point to really, really quickly was a multi-location group, 5 or 6 locations maybe in the Northeast that had like 4 or 5 different partners, multi-specialty, and they could not get these owners could not get on the same page. They all owned different pieces and different percentages of the different practices, and they were trying to consolidate them into a whole, but everybody was fighting over what was theirs at a practice level. When you go into business with partners or you form partnerships, you have to think 1 + 1 = 3. And if you're only thinking about yourself first and you're not willing to give up something to get something greater, then the partnership fundamentally won't work. And theirs was a walking, talking case study of that. Furthermore, they had holes in their operating agreement between partners that did not necessitate for active ownership, active operational responsibilities or clinical responsibilities in the business to maintain your ownership. It's called non-operating partner. So literally they could decide, each one could independently decide to quit practicing dentistry, but maintain their ownership in the business. And again, fundamental misalignment around, values, trust, and the things that they were seemingly trying to come together to build that none of them could do independently. So learned a lot from both of those experiences, but hopefully that's helpful for your audience as well.
Yeah, that's great context to bring that to life for us. I appreciate that. I, I promise to come back to the second part of that,
Sure.
which is about risk. And, reflecting back on your time, what do you think was let's call it the hardest career risk you took? And what did you learn from that?
I think the hardest career risk for me was that the Richmond branch of Patterson in July of 2002, after we had sold the family business. And I think um, the risk was multifaceted. I had lived in Raleigh for 5 years, Raleigh, North Carolina, for 5 years at that time, and I had made some of the best friends of my life still to this day. I'm blessed to be able to keep in touch with them and to see them with a high degree of regularity. Just people that I felt like I had known my entire life, even though it had only been a couple of years. And I left them all behind. I mean, I made the conscious decision to follow a career and to leave that cocoon of friends in my rearview mirror. Um, and for a 31-year-old, that's a big step. It's a bet on yourself, right? And obviously wasn't married and no kids, so I didn't have to make decisions for others, but in the anxiety of exiting a family business and all the dynamics that are involved with that, and taking on a completely different role that I had never done before, that I was walking into a branch that had really imploded is the right word. The former general manager there and a lot of the key employees had actually left Patterson to populate a competitor branch, all but directly across the street. I was walking in, I didn't know anybody. I was the youngest person in the branch by about 3 or 4 years of age at that point in time. I was 31 and I was running the thing. And I had never done it before. And Patterson's training program back then was, here are the keys, don't screw it up. And, that was one that just based around the nature, the circumstances, and everything else, both personally and professionally, was probably the highest level of risk that I took on. And I just I said to myself that I may get drummed out of here, right? I may not last very long, but if I'm going to do this, I'm gonna do it the best way I know how. And I think that, you know, telling people that certain practices were going to stop and were going to cease the day that I got there, because they were dishonest at a minimum and unethical, possibly otherwise, was not going to be something I was going to sign off on. Um, Staring down underperformers and telling them that, they were going to have to leave when they were beloved within the branch, created some enemies in the branch for me. Um, Not telling people what they wanted to hear, but being truthful and candid to the best of my ability, but trying to tell people why I was making the decision that I was. And a lot of the decisions that I made, people didn't understand and they sure as heck didn't agree with in the moment. And I was fortunate that most of those decisions, not all of them, but most of them played out the way that I thought they would. And it benefited everyone. And that's when you start to kind of prove it to yourself and you build a track record of credibility. And I'll never forget, I terminated a lot of employees. I terminated a key employee after about a year of being in there. And the number one sales rep in the entire company happened to be in the Richmond branch and had the cell phone of the CEO of the entire company and used to vacation with the CEO at his house in Beaver Creek in the summertime. And when I fired this particular employee, and the sales rep in question, who was an older gentleman, who he and I didn't see eye to eye, but I had a lot of respect for him. I don't know that he had that much respect for me at the time, but it quickly went up the flagpole, like literally to the CEO of the company, about Perrin's driving the thing into the ground, and he just fired this particular employee after he had the biggest equipment sale and all this kind of stuff. And it looked like I was burning down the house. And so I walked into, I knew it was going to be a challenging week when I led into that on Monday, terminating this particular employee. And by the time I got home Monday evening, I'll never forget, I walked in my front door, and as I'm walking through my living room, my cell phone starts ringing, and it's a Minneapolis, St. Paul area code number. And I'm like, this is probably a call I
Here
should
we go.
take. Yeah. And so I answered the phone, and I heard the voice that said, Perrin, this is Gary Johnson. Gary was the long-standing vice president of sales and one of the original founders of Patterson, a guy that had like the Polaris to rival anyone in the industry. And I sort of stood up straight and I said, hi, Gary, how's your day going? And he said, well, tell me what happened with so-and-so, so-and-so. And I said, well, here's what I saw. Here's what I thought. Here's why I did what I did. And here's why I'm firm on it, that this is the right decision. And without missing a beat, Gary said, Perrin, that's why we put you in the job, to do what you're doing. Don't stop. Keep going. Have a good night. And I thought,
Awesome.
all
Yeah.
right, okay, that's knowing that I've got it at several levels above me. That's all I needed to know. And that was really a pivotal turning point after about 12 months there. So, or at least the victor gets to write the history, right? That's the way I'm saying it. So,
Sure. Well, biggest risks come biggest rewards, so they say, right?
yep,
You've worked now, gosh, in corporate, you've built startups, and now you're coaching healthcare entrepreneurs. And I'm sure you have so much content knowledge and stories like that. and more importantly, the lessons learned from that to share with others. Um, what core values have remained unchanged across each chapter of your career?
Yeah, so hopefully there are a lot, but maybe I'll share a couple off the top of my head that are relevant also to your audience for the businesses that they're leading and building and are transitioning from that role from a clinician to a CEO type of a scenario even. And I would tell you that um all of us who grow up through organizations or who start out being a practitioner of the craft. Okay. It doesn't matter if you're a clinical dentist or you're a salesperson or what, but like you rise to some level of mastery for whatever the craft is. And usually those are the people who either get promoted in a corporate scenario or maybe in your audience's world, Kevin, like start to take on greater levels of complexity by adding locations or building bigger businesses or something. You go
Hmm.
from being a practitioner of the craft to being a manager or a leader of people. And I think the thing that I had to learn early on that I've been able to maintain or continue to extrapolate in different roles would be the realization that as a leader, you are now charged with creating a greater level of results through others than what you could do on your own in the same given period of time. Right. And that's leadership leverage. Right. I mean, obviously you can point to it in the early stages in your military career. It's the same thing, right? You go from being somebody who does the thing to leading those who do the thing, and they do it at a greater level, at arguably a higher level of output and outcomes than what you could do on your own in the same period of time. And I think that's critically important to realize, because in a leadership context, at least, if you embrace that, then if you're any good at it, then you start to understand that regardless of what you're doing, like what the type of business is that you own or lead, as a leader, communication, your ability to communicate with people, both individually or in a small group or in a collective address, if you will, is critically important. Dwight Eisenhower talks about leadership is fundamentally getting people to want to do what you want them to do, right? And if you're a good communicator with people, you instill a belief system that that the individuals may not have on their own, or a level of confidence like Gary Johnson did with me in that phone call that I referenced, or you know, um, maybe during difficult times or times of uncertainty, the the belief that we're gonna be okay, that we're gonna get through this, and your ability to connect with people in good times is not necessarily that stressful because you probably got a rising tide that lifts all boats. But in times of trial, it's critically important that your people hear from you, that they believe in you, and that they trust you. And that level of trust is what I pointed to in my early days in Richmond, that I was able to galvanize that with a lot of people. And when you're an effective leader and you communicate really well and you earn the trust of your people, that trust becomes your most valuable currency. And at some point, you're going to ask people to do something that they don't understand and they probably don't agree with. But if you've earned their trust, that's the time you're going to spend that currency. And when you spend that currency, you've got it when they say, "Hey, boss, I don't get it, but if you say this is what we got to do, I'm going to do it." Right? And that's where you know that you're effective. And I think those sort of that self-awareness and that understanding of leadership qualities and being a master at the craft of leading people is something that I've been able to perpetuate at different levels of my career. I don't know that I'm necessarily great at it, but at least I'm aware of it, and it's, paid dividends for me, up to this point. And I try to share that obviously with a lot of people that I work with too.
Well, sure. Yeah, I mean, the evidence is there. You have been successful at it. And I think what you shared is very true. Certainly, in my experience, whether that's in corporate leadership or harkening back to military days, very much the case. I'd like to pivot a bit, Perrin, if you don't mind. You've got this really deep knowledge of the dental industry. And there's a lot of things happening right now. I talk to a lot of folks in this industry. And so I'm probably aware of just a fraction of them. I'd love to get some of your deeper knowledge. How would you describe the current state of the dental industry in 2025 from a business model and ownership perspective?
Wow, that's a great question. And so maybe the way I would describe it would be, um, I don't want to get too esoteric here or anything with you, but it's kind of in that liminal state. It's no longer what it was, but it hasn't become what it will be yet. You're kind of that tweener stage, and I think that you can look at, I mean, the most obvious thing to point to are private equity backed enterprise level DSOs, and the influence of investor capital in the space. And that is certainly a driver of it. You specifically are involved with artificial intelligence. And for me, at an earlier phase of my career was digital technology, and there's been CAD CAM influence and everything in between. You've got the young dentists now coming out of dental school with an unbelievable amount of educational debt to the tune of about 300 grand on average, and 80% of the graduating students are carrying some level of debt, and the average about 300 grand. That's before they even go to specialty school or anything like that. So, there's the debt burden, and then you've got this like generational change in terms of your perspectives and values and communication abilities and everything like that. But the other thing too that you've got that I think that is part and parcel of all this is the consumer aspect of it, right? I mean, you got 50% of the patients, or 50% of the adult population in the United States doesn't see a dentist on an annual basis. So,
Which is a staggering statistic,
isn't it,
isn't it?
right? So is that an access to care argument? Is that hey, we've had fluoride in the water for a while now. We have healthier mouths and we don't need as much dental work. But I think the other thing is the younger adult population really approaches buying healthcare services from a consumer type of a mentality. And so for them, it's convenience and transparency is the way they make decisions, not provider centric decisions based on the merit of the dentist himself or herself. And I think that type of consumer lens yields a lot of commoditization of the profession. That's not a good thing, because it becomes, hey, I just need to get my teeth cleaned, and that's an interchangeable parts mentality that's not great. And I think we all deal with that. And dentists that are in their second half of their career or late stages of their career, it's difficult to, when I start talking about things like the patient experience and stuff like that, I mean, these are people that have a challenge in terms of reinventing themselves, from that type of a consumer-driven lens these days. And I think that is creating challenges too. So I think the model is changing due to the proliferation of group practices, be they emerging group practices owned and operated by dentists and using bank funds to grow, or private equity-backed enterprise-level groups. The economies of scale argument is the same for healthcare services as it is for dental distribution or Lowe's and Home Depot or hotel and restaurant management. It doesn't matter what the industry is or the sector is. All that buying power and negotiating ability counts, and it counts in dentistry every bit as much as any other business, and that's not going away. But what I think the confluence of all this and the technological implementation and envelope of technology that yields more predictable, repeatable clinical results in less time is ultimately the benefit for the patient. And I think you wrap all that stuff around itself and you put it in a blender and turn it on high, and you've got kind of what we've got in dentistry right now. But with that comes opportunity as well. Dentistry has been a very evolutionary, not a revolutionary type of a profession, and that's been to its benefit and the merits of it for a long time. But I would tell you, in the last 15 years of my career, Kevin, it's been far more revolutionary than it ever has been evolutionary. And I think that can actually be a very good thing.
And given this evolutionary versus revolutionary topic of conversation, if you look back on their early days of your career until now, what would you say has changed the most in the business of dentistry? Is it private equity's involvement, or is it a derivative thereof? I mean, I'd love to get your perspective on that.
So I think if you go back to the early stages of my career, which like I say, entered Thompson Dental Company in late 1995, this was the time that, dentists who took out an ad in the yellow pages were shunned by their peers. Okay, so yellow pages, most of your audience don't even know what that is. But the fact that you would ever own a business and not market it or advertise it is, heresy now. So I would say, some of the driving forces over my 3 decades in the business side of dentistry are certainly technologically driven. Electronic medical records and the integration of digitized x-rays and camera images and all that kind of stuff that was the early stage of my career. Then you've got, the proliferation of CAD CAM and 3D imaging types of devices that just unlock treatment envelopes that were very challenging to accommodate, especially on the general dentistry side, has been absolutely tremendous. AI is the current version of all that will be a catalyst to creating ultimately better diagnosis, more case acceptance, and more consistent, repeatable outcomes, and that's all a great thing. So I don't think you can underscore the last probably 2 decades or more and say that technology has not been a driver of it. Technology, much like Jim Collins talks about in the book Good to Great, is an accelerant to the flywheel. It is not the competitive advantage. It helps unlock what you do at a better rate. And I think that we see that in dentistry. And then I think the changing of the profession now that there are more than 50% females entering dental school is a massive sea change of the last only handful of years. And shame on you and me being a couple of guys behind a few microphones here, but female healthcare practitioners tend to create a higher level of trust and empathy with anxious patients. And the word anxious patients probably counts for about 80% of the patients in a dental practice. And so I think seeing more females entering the workforce is ultimately a great thing. And I think it will be, I don't want to say an even better thing, but it will certainly not diminish the standard of care in any way if it doesn't create something greater because of it. I think the third thing is obviously the model, around private equity and venture capital type ownership structures and again, kind of accelerating the consolidation is the wave that everybody points to, but I think it's only a component of it.
Speaking about that last point here, I'd like to come back to some of the earlier ones, but the last point here that, there's a lot of buzz around consolidation and private equity. Where do you think that's headed?
You know, it's not going away. Um, and private equity. I think we need to caution ourselves a little bit here, because we're all of a herd mentality at some level, you know, and if I rewind the tape prior to COVID, um, you know, private equity's entrance into the space was prolific, and recaps of some original platforms were starting to happen in 2017, 18, and 19, and those recaps were gaudy in their outcomes. Some as much as a 9 times cash on cash return, which is in like a 3-year period. Just
Yeah, crazy.
insane. The gold rush, right? And so, everybody was private equity, EBITDA, valuation multiple, second bite of the apple, equity roll, this drumbeat. And that was all happening at the time. And I think the fallacy is that we tend to latch on as a wildebeest in the herd. We tend to latch on to whatever the trend is and think that it's going to continue unabated. And when we came back from COVID, the government and 3 rounds of stimulus, and the Fed leaving federal funds rates at all but zero, you know the credit boxes that private equity backed groups borrowing money and using leverage to get more deals done, the credit boxes were really wide. There was a ton of available debt funding to use against an equity position for leverage, and the rates to borrow it were nothing. And so you didn't have to be an operator at any level, and you didn't have to, of any business, be it a healthcare services business or otherwise. You could literally print money. And so we saw a bunch of people rushing into the space who had, some type of an investor relationship, and they could lever it up at 6 times and buy a bunch of dental practices for several turns over what they should academically be valued at, and convince the sellers who were scared to death about owning healthcare services businesses in a COVID environment, that they should roll a lot of equity, and we're, we're going to make bank on the recap, right? Well, the high water mark, and really the probably the tip of the iceberg, or top of the mountain in terms of valuations and recaps, probably around 2021. And what nobody seems to think about or ask about is we've been in a pretty incredible bull market for the better part of 2 freaking decades,
Yeah.
right? And some of that's driven through technology. Some of it's driven through changes in banking regulations that put some of this speculative money piece, taking it out of a formal banking structure due to Dodd-Frank, and allowing private equity to adopt some of the same principles and drive it into the marketplace. But now when everybody's thinking about private equity based on the merits of a recap, and recaps don't happen, is there a pinprick in the balloon? Like, does all of it go rushing out? And so I don't think that all private equity groups are good, and I don't think that all private equity groups are bad. What I would tell you is that you have to go back to two things in my mind. One is the fundamental operational characteristics of whatever the business is. And in healthcare services, that's, prospective patient attraction, it's treatment conversion, it's operational integrity through scheduling and not having any unforced errors or gaps or anything, and then it's revenue cycle management, collecting the money on the back end. Now, that equation that I just described, you can apply to a hardware store, a healthcare services business, or anything else you want to, right? And in this case, it's dentistry. And if you do that from an ownership standpoint, and you're at least acquiring businesses at a reasonable level, you're probably going to operate a pretty good business that cash flows fairly well and can satisfy the debt service requirements of it, not get you into trouble with the lender or have a covenant bust or something like that. But the second piece to this is when we start talking about selling our life's work to a private equity backed venture, and they're willing to pay me a ton of money for my practice and I'm going to roll a bunch of equity, the release of the equity roll is dependent upon the recap. And I think people
Explain,
just
yeah,
think that's
explain
going to
what that
happen.
is for some of our
Yeah.
listeners. And I would say this, Perrin, before you answer. Almost to a one of those that I've had on the show and that I've talked to that, maybe didn't come on the show, they talk about in medical school and dental school, the focus on the clinical, but not on the business. So this would be great for our audience just to hear you explain that a bit,
Yeah.
unpack.
Again, I'll try not to be esoteric, just be simple here. So basically, a private equity firm has an investment thesis. In this case, our thesis is that there's value to be created in the world of dentistry, that we can create economies of scale, their buying power and their negotiating power on insurance reimbursement rates. We can create efficiencies in a business that unlock greater value due to size and might versus what you can do in a solo practice. All of that's valid, right? And I can tell you that from our family business of a dental distribution company, and Patterson being a publicly traded company could create a heck of a lot more than we could use borrowing money from a bank, right? So the principles are the same. So when we look at private equity, there is an equity investment, an ownership investment in a business, and the private equity backed group borrows money from a bank or a non-bank lender to make that equity investment go further. They can buy more dental practices. Well, the theory is that by buying more dental practices, they unlock more value from a cash flow standpoint called EBITDA, normalized cash flow. And at some point in time, the business gets to be big enough and valuable enough by the marketplace that the current private equity owner takes the business to market and essentially sells their stake to a larger private equity backed company that can take the business to the next level, right? So just like you and I may be executives, Kevin, I can run a $10 million revenue business with 50 people in it. But if you put me in a $300 million business with 200 people in it, I'm way over my capabilities, right? I don't have the ability to do that, in theory at least. And it's the same thing in a private equity world. There's certain private equity backed groups that unlock value at certain levels, and they hand the business off to another one that can do it at a larger level. All right. And ultimately, if this is perpetuated on and on and on down the line, then maybe there's an initial public offering or an IPO down the road, right? And people have speculated about some of that in our space. The key, though, going back to your original part of the question where we were in our conversation, is when a dentist sells his or her business to a private equity backed group and they roll equity, meaning they take whatever the value is of the business, they take 80% of it out in cash, and the other 20% they roll into equity, into ownership, into the parent company. The ability to get that second tranche of equity out is usually dependent upon the business, the overall business, transacting from one private equity group to the larger one at a higher valuation multiple. All right. So we call that the waterfall, essentially, that now says the value of my business was $1 million. I took 800,000 in cash. I rolled 200,000 into equity. In 5 years, the business recaps and that 200,000 becomes 600,000, for example, and I'm paid out of the recap of the business. Well, there's nothing necessarily invalid about that in any way, but it is highly dependent upon exterior market dynamics that you no longer control. and that your parent company, private equity-backed venture, doesn't actually control either. And some of that is, first and foremost, this amalgamated group of 100 practices. How's the business performing, right? I mean, if it's no longer performing as well as when they acquired all 100 practices, we have an operational problem. And this has hit a number of the groups because they were looking to aggregate dots on a map and not operate them for improved cash flow or efficiency or increased valuation. So
Do you think that's because it was sort of a land rush and
completely,
yeah.
completely. These were groups that had no other rhyme or reason than trying to make it on the turn or make it on the flip. And that has created a lot of anxiety, justifiably so, by dentists who sold their life's work to what became a fly-by-night type of a venture. And this is not healthy for the industry, the profession, or anyone. Okay? Because if you don't approach business building from an operational mentality, if you're only looking to use your term, a land grab, then that is, I mean, that's betting on black in Vegas and, all that kind of jazz. I don't gamble, so I shouldn't have even gone down that as an analogy. But, so the problem is now we've got a scenario where there are a lot of groups that didn't have any operational integrity and couldn't unlock any value at a practice level. We've also got a lot of groups that overpaid for practices originally when they started acquiring them. Most private equity-backed groups, when they borrow money, they borrow it in a loan structure that is akin to you and I buying a home with an interest-only loan. All right, so they're making interest payments, but not principal payments. But that principal has a balloon payment that comes due, and that's kind of a day of reckoning, right? So if you and I take on an interest-only
ticking time bomb.
Yeah, right? So we buy a $5 million home because we can afford an interest-only loan payment when, that's 2.25. What happens when it rate corrects to 7.25? All of a sudden we might not be able.
Which we saw in the 2008 financial crisis.
Exactly right. Exactly right. It's not a whole lot different. But, this is creating a logjam for recaps that can't get done or won't get done because now the company that would be buying them, the company that would be the second investor, the acquirer, if you will, of the recap. There's a seller in a recap, there's a buyer in a recap, right? So now the buyers are having to borrow money at today's lending rates and at today's credit structures. There's an inverse relationship between valuation multiples and lending rates. And what we see is that the speculative valuation multiples of 2021 and even 2022 are probably 2 to 3 turns down. And that makes it really challenging on a recap to be able to return any of the locked up equity for those dentists who originally sold their business. So you see a lot of recaps that may get done and the private equity groups change hands, but there's no equity return to shareholders at a common stock level. And now that's creating quite a problem. Sorry, we went off on a tangent, but I hope that was helpful.
That's extremely helpful. And I hope our audience can appreciate that this is not only a problem in dentistry, but it's a problem across industries due to macroeconomic issues related to interest rates. That's part of it. But the points that you made around the multiples paid, and now with higher interest rates, you can't get the recap that you want. How do you think this plays out over the next, let's say, nobody has a crystal ball, right? But let's say over the next 2 to 3 years, what do you think happens?
I think, I think we got a couple of things at a macro level happening. So one, specifically those private equity-backed ventures that overpaid for businesses and have not been able to create performance at a clinic level have to figure out how to do that, and or they're probably going to have to go through some type of a reorganization process, what's known as workout processes, with their lender to restructure their balance sheet. That is intensely problematic from an equity standpoint. Debt gets paid before equity, and the lender gets satisfied before you and I do if we roll equity into a venture. We get paid last, right? So, that at a minimum, that's a costly process, and it will probably take an extended period of time before the business right sizes, for lack of a better term. Worst case scenario, you have a balance sheet that's upside down, that the equity is, that the debt far outweighs the equity. There is no equity value in it. And those are businesses that banks and non-bank lenders don't want to own dental practices. So they start selling off assets for pennies on the dollar when and where the private equity group basically hands the keys back over to the lender. And we've seen a little bit of that, not a ton of it yet, but when I talk to some of the, what I'll say are larger law firms in our space, and I know a couple of the principals behind them, they're the ones who speak at all the industry conferences and everything. And over a cup of coffee, if I ask one of them, hey, how many workout processes are you involved in these days? And obviously they can't name names due to client confidentiality, but when they say more than at any time in my entire career, that's more than a canary in a coal mine. Okay. So there's that piece on like the I'll say financial health of some of these businesses. The second thing is the fact that, supposedly there were, there's some statistic going around the industry. I haven't seen this or know how it's attributed, so I probably shouldn't share it. But in the last 2.5 years, there have only been 7 recaps that came to fruition and 44 were pulled.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that creates a log jam at the top of the food chain, right? And these are businesses that have to go through some level of, rolling up their shirt sleeves and creating operational clinic value where it's diminished recently. And I think that's going to tamp down M&A activity overall, as they get themselves put back together, if they're able to. The next thing is that you've got a lot of enterprise level groups. And the one I like to just use as an example would be, like a Heartland Dental, because everybody knows their name. But when you think about from a business like that, the volume of EBITDA that they have to acquire or create every year, this is a business that historically has bought or built the equivalent of about 200 locations a year. That's one almost every day. Are you better off at an enterprise level like that trying to shoot with a rifle to hunt rabbits? Or are you better off, trying to get out a bigger weapon and take down a moose, right? And so we talk about the consolidation of the consolidators. And at some point, I think you're bound to see, you could call it mergers, of something like a Heartland that would be a national company merging into it a regional private equity backed DSO that would be accretive to market share and accretive to EBITDA, so that they don't have to go out and hunt 250 onesie twosies every year. And so I think a lot of this, ultimately translates into fewer solo practice transactions happening that are acquired by private equity. Now, with that comes a tremendous opportunity for our mid-career dentists that are looking to build their own 3 to 5 location group or 10 location group or something like that, where, now due to lack of M&A activity from the corporate entities, they can probably get more transactions done. And oh, by the way, maybe a lot of those sellers aren't really enthusiastic about selling their life's work to a private equity-backed venture anymore because it hasn't played out that well for their peers who rolled equity recently. And maybe they'd rather hitch their wagon to smaller businesses owned by a dentist colleague, who does a better job of preserving their legacy. And so I think, with that other side of the coin comes a lot more opportunity in the entrepreneurial space and the emerging group space. And I think that's one where you start to get some of the economies of scale and the reducing redundancy piece that can be really, really compelling in this next probably 5 to 10 years.
Well, you mentioned earlier technology is a change wave that you experienced. The rumble now is about AI and whether or not it can deliver efficiencies that, if not help, certainly not, ameliorate, but maybe play a role in the economics of the industry, or more specifically in patient outcomes, operational efficiency, that type of thing. What do you see happening with AI, or maybe a derivative thereof? The two words are often used interchangeably, but let's say AI and or automation. What do you see happening in this space as it relates to those?
I think technology, when implemented correctly, allows you to create velocity in a business through a delivery of service or delivery of product at a higher conversion rate with in this case, hopefully greater level of predictability in terms of outcome. And much like other technology-enabled service aspects of all of healthcare, I think AI is going to unlock a new frontier for that. I think it's going to make clinicians better diagnosticians, if I said that correctly. I think it's going to give them a greater level of confidence. I think it's also going to be an enabler of greater case acceptance, because the show and tell, or the see and understand piece from a patient perspective is ultimately to their benefit. That historically, well, it's not hurting me, so I'm not going to get it fixed. Well, that might not be in your best interest, right? And here's what I see, or here's how I know. And so I think that in this case, AI and to a degree automation will be an accelerant to more efficient delivery of services at a higher clinical outcome. And I think that's great for the profession, and ultimately it's great for the patient. I think where this thing goes off the rails a little bit is if we allow AI to take on too great of a role in terms of what I termed earlier, the patient experience. And that's the real piece that I worry about. If it's something like, using an AI to chase down insurance claims so that you and I don't have to wait on the phone for somebody or something like that, that's all good. If it's a way of maybe, taking some appointment confirmation calls or something like that, then that's all fine and good. But I think what we need to embrace really is that healthcare services, and dentistry specifically, are an incredibly personal, intimate relationship with your consumer. And if you lean into that and embrace that and try to create a differentiation in terms of patient experience, you create more patient loyalty and customer cohesion, right? You become less of a commodity. There's a better level of trust. They stay in your practice, and don't wander around aimlessly to other practices. And those who look at AI in terms of efficiency in its entirety discount the relationship that they need to create every time a patient walks through their front door. And I think that's where it goes in the wrong direction. I don't want to be a commodity. I want to feel like I have a personal relationship with all of my healthcare providers. Yeah, if I got a do something in an automated basis, AI driven, or phone menu or whatever else, text to confirm, that's all fine and good. I don't care about that. But, if it's something that interrupts my relationship with the people who are diagnosing, presenting, and providing my care, then I start to think twice about that.
Yeah. So what I'm hearing is leads, client retention, okay. In the operatory, it is more about that show and tell, right? Um, and help others understand what's being recommended from a treatment plan perspective, but not letting it get in the way of that intimate relationship with a patient.
That's right.
Does that sound about
That's
right?
right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Well, let's pivot a little bit. If you're a solo practitioner looking to grow, given all the conversation we just had about the state of the industry, what from your perspective in the here and now, what's the smartest move to make first? Is it hire, acquire, or partner? And maybe why would you recommend one of those?
Um, it it kind of depends on your age, honestly. I mean, I tend to um I tend to think about this differently. You and I are basically the same age, mid 50s. And if you got somebody that's 5 years from retirement, I think it's the be thinking about a transaction and tidying up the business and understanding relative to the value of the transaction, who the buyer is, the ramifications of all of that. But if you're mid-career, um, I think the the most compelling segment of the space is the mid-career practice owner who has a successful practice. He or she is a what I would call a master clinician, and the practice itself operates predictably and efficiently from a cash flow, from an operational standpoint, all of that, right? And I think you can build from strength given that. When we start talking about partnering with a private equity backed venture or otherwise, if done prematurely, you're probably gonna place the burden on a return on equity that would not exceed the return on cash flows over the next, call it, 2 decades, right? So you got to think, like, where do the graphs cross in terms of income versus equity? And those are not, those are kind of competing interests in a business for all intents and purposes. So, I think if you're mid-career and you have a stable practice and you're a master clinician and um, you're trying to build a business that's not dependent upon yourself, or de-risk it a little bit, then I think you owe it to yourself to start thinking about either an additional location and or bringing in an additional associate if you don't already have one. And I think the first thing to think about there is, what's your personal standard of living relative to the amount of cash that you pull out of your business, and how much cash are you sitting on in terms of a rainy day fund? Because anybody that starts out a growth process, if you acquire another practice or build one, you're going to borrow money from a bank to do it. But when you start bringing in associates, you gotta feed them some of the work that you're no longer doing. And the dirty little secret is, once we start to build a business that's not dependent upon our own skill set exclusively, we start to take an income hit for a short-term period to do that. And I find that there are far too many people that just are not either aware of that, or if they are aware of it, they haven't prepared adequately for it. It's a completely avoidable problem, but you know, we would rather not get in a conflict with our family all but immediately in terms of spending habits when we start to build a bigger business.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Let me dial in on that for a moment here. If I'm retiring, let's say I'm a multi-practice owner, I'm looking to retire in the next 2 to 3 years. Question number one, what type of market do you think I'm going to face? And number two, what are some of the action steps that I should start right now?
I think if you build a business, build a good business, there's always going to be a buyer for it. So this is not a black and white, all or nothing type thing. And I think this becomes one about the merits of the buyer and the deal structure itself. So if this is a couple of locations and it's a fairly valuable business, meaning it's going to value highly, you get into things like, okay, how much, um, how much of the transaction, how much do you want to be in cash and how much are you willing to roll equity in? And you gotta think about the equity roll as if you're writing a check to invest in that business, right? The next thing
which
is,
you may not get back. That's what I'm hearing.
that's right. I mean,
Given
there's risk with it. Yeah. I mean, there's probably a way to get, I wouldn't say it would be all gone. There is the possibility of that, but not the probability of it, And so I think, what's the business that you're selling your business to? What is their growth strategy? What are they going to do to take some of the burdens off your shoulders? What's the value that they're going to bring to your business at a clinic level that you haven't been able to unlock yourself? And what do you want your role to be after the transaction? They're probably going to ask you to stay on board in some capacity. What do you want that to be? Part-time associate type of a role, a local clinical development leader, business development? Like what does it look like for you over these next couple of years? And then given whatever work requirement it might be, 3 to 5 years, what happens if the business doesn't recap during that period of time? Is there a way for you to do what's known as putting your shares to the company? It's called put and call rights. Like, I'm leaving, I want to take my equity out. How does that happen? How is it calculated? What are the ramifications around all of that? Is it even a possibility? And I think those are things like if you're going to hitch your wagon to a bigger company, you got to think like several steps down the line of what happens and does this happen? Yes or no? Given if it does, what are the repercussions of it? And I think that's somewhat of the short-sightedness that too many people have gotten into trouble with based around where they are now with the merits or lack thereof of the parent company. We like to say that every transaction is made up of two things: cash flow and risk, right? And so if you're thinking that you might want to transact your business in a couple of years, it's probably in your best interest to talk to an M&A advisor relatively soon to get their initial pass on what your business looks like from a valuation perspective and from a risk perspective. For example, if you are 100% owner of the business, it's multiple locations, and you do a lot of super complicated dentistry at a high level and account for a lot of collections, then there's a lot of risk wrapped up around you, and especially if that type of dentistry is not able to be taken on by an average associate. Now we have some level of provider risk. If you're a specialist and you get all of your referrals from one particular practice or two particular practices in your area, then that's concentration risk. What happens if Heartland Dental buys those two locations? What happens to your business? So these are things when we talk about cash flow and risk, it's important to ascertain now before you're in market where the risks lie within your business, how reasonable they are, and if it went bad, what would be the resulting downturn in the cash flow. And you gotta solve for that before you're in market, because somebody's going to ask about it and you need to have the answer to it.
Yeah, and I know you've consulted with so many multi-site healthcare practices. If you can, maybe think about and help us understand what separates the successful ones from the ones that struggle to scale.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ones that struggle to scale really make a number of fundamental mistakes early on. They probably grow too quickly, meaning the bank will loan them, maybe not in today's world, but historically, the bank was willing to loan them a higher volume of debt than what they themselves could borrow, acquire, and integrate. So they went from 1 to 4 locations seemingly overnight, and they created a mess, right? The second thing would be that they weren't prepared from a cash reserves, cash on balance sheet standpoint to start the growth journey, and they've seen a decline in their personal level of income. So I used to always, I want to say that I laughed. I laughed internally when I would always get the question of, Perrin, will you please explain to me how it is that I've gone from 1 to 4 locations. I've got a business that generates 4 times the amount of revenue, and I'm making half the amount of income as when I owned 1 location. How is that possible? So I created a presentation deck that has like 3 slides, and I'm like, A, B, and C. Here's how it happens. And they're like, yep, yep, and yep. So, when we're not prepared for growth, it creates cash flow issues that are intensely problematic and very stressful, and to a degree avoidable. They also fail to understand that you never buy a business to maintain it. You always buy a business to improve it. And this is not an aggregating dots on a map thing like we talked about in a prior part of our conversation. If you're acquiring practices, what are 2 or 3 things you're going to do that you intend to do to take cost out of their operating structure? What are 2 or 3 things that you intend to do to generate revenue that they haven't been able to do yet? If you don't have some type of secret sauce, for lack of a better term, to unlock greater value, then why are you buying the business to begin with? Because these businesses are much more at razor thin margins than anybody really wants to admit. And usually when I say, have you pressure tested your acquisition assumption? And they're like, what's a pressure test? And I'm like, run the numbers with a 5% revenue decline and tell me if you're in the red or the black at an operating margin. And they're like, how do I even do that? Well, it's not rocket science, but I can tell you that if you have a 5% revenue decline and the business goes from being in the black to being in the red, you have a looming problem and not very much margin for error. The bank will get paid, you might not. And so, these are things that when we think about building our own group, it's not a matter of borrowing money to buy or build practices. How do you operate them? How do you integrate them? How does your personal role change in the business? Because you will go from being a solo practice owner where, Kevin, we all know enough of them where, like, if they do something wrong, they can outwork their problems, right? I can work another Friday or 2 to make up for it. I can just work harder for a little while longer and I can sweep it all under the rug. You can't do that when you own multiple locations. And that is a fallacy in terms of a mentality that people bring into a group practice equation that is fraught with danger.
Well, what you're talking about here at some level, Perrin, is really a leadership challenge, right?
Yep.
In terms of focusing on what you're going to bring to the practice. How is your role as a leader going to change? And I know that these owners are facing a changing and challenging marketplace. That is likely to require some real intense leadership in order to be able to weather that change successfully. And I know you personally are involved in helping practice owners and leaders. So let's talk about the coaching work that you do through the Next Level Executive. Could you walk us through the structure of your program, what it is, who it's designed for, and how it works?
Yeah, happy to. Thanks for the opportunity. And it's I kind of chuckle because it sort of started out as a passion play and has actually become, a semi-legitimate business. So I haven't fired myself yet for what it's worth, but so I think I'm at a point in time where I don't mean this egotistically in any way, but I've had a fairly successful career and I've learned a lot over the years, and I've been blessed to have had a lot of experiences. Most of them have been positive, some have been negative, but I'm relatively self-aware and I've been able to take inventory of a lot of them, and so next level executive is I'm a solopreneur, I guess you could say. And I've built a small business where I have about 25 people in the program. And the core contents of next level executive are about 4 different quarters of the calendar year that are teaching modules essentially. And it's all of my experience from corporate America, some of which we've talked about today, in the leadership capacity. It's me being an entrepreneur in 2 very successful ventures. Um, it's me having worked alongside a lot of entrepreneurial dentists in terms of their growth journeys, and all of the things that I've seen that are either blind spots or where people step into a bear trap or what gets them in trouble, like we were just talking about some of them. You know, there are a lot of what I would call business fundamentals that you need to understand from an ownership perspective and a leadership perspective if you think you want to build your own group. And a group could be 2 or 3 locations, it could be 20 or 30. I'm not here to talk you into it, but if you have created a successful practice and you've got tremendous clinical skills and you've got stable operations, you've got a pretty good business that runs pretty predictably. And usually when people hit that level, they're somewhere around mid-career, late 30s to early 50s or something. And they're kind of wondering what's next. And if we go back to like 2018, 2019, what's next was always, let me go buy another practice. Everybody else is doing it. And some of that worked out well and some of it didn't. But I think today's, you know, audience that I kind of cater to is much more methodical in their approach. And what I try to stress to them is a lot of what we've been talking about today. You go from being a clinician who owns a practice into an entrepreneur who owns a business. And those are not the same things, because when you own a business, if you're going to grow it, you've got to make interconnected decisions that have downstream repercussions. And those can be positive or they may close off doors if done incorrectly. So if I, through my personal experience and consulting work and being an entrepreneur, you know, if I already know the top 10 to 12 to 15 mistakes that everybody makes along the way, why would you want to start out at mistake number 1 or number 2? You know, I mean, I've got a tremendous group of entrepreneurs in my business. Almost all of them are dentists. I've got one podiatrist, and I've had some interest from derm and med spa and some other healthcare verticals that are, you know, the characteristics are the same that I'm talking about here.
Sure.
But, you know, they want to learn how to be a more effective executive of the business that they own. And they want to feel confident from a subject matter standpoint of making those types of decisions that reflect the risks that they've taken to found the business and to start to grow the business. And I think that's a really fun dynamic where I get to talk a lot about leadership. I get to talk about driving results through other people. I get to talk about, you know, partnership challenges. The 4 sectors of the program play off of themes. I send them a teaching video on Sunday or Monday of every week that has a PDF of a PowerPoint deck of whatever the subject is that I'm teaching. They can watch it at their leisure over the course of the week. We get together on Friday for about 60 to 90 minutes and do a deep dive into the discussion around that subject matter or whatever else is, you know, top of mind to them. So it's a 1-to-many model that I teach over Zoom. It makes it super convenient from the comfort of their own home. I'll do 2 workshops this year when we get the band together live and in person. And we'll do a deeper dive into hands-on nature of a lot of the material. And it's been a tremendous amount of fun. For me, it's been incredibly fulfilling. I really feel like it's tapped into a lot of my wheelhouse of experiential knowledge and wisdom up to this point. And I think the people who are in the program get a lot of value out of it. And I hope that they are starting to feel like they're better equipped to really drive results in the business that they own. If I'm achieving all of that for them, then it's why I'm doing it. So
Well, you mentioned one to many, but I have to imagine there's a many to many aspect to this, right? Peer to peer, you're getting folks together. Is there a peer to peer component of this learning experience as well?
yeah, there's so this business I only launched it January 1st of this year, so we're 7 months in, and I started some of the bones of it last year at Polaris just to kind of get proof of concept, if you will. And so I think the group collaborates a lot with one another in a healthy way. I mean, most of them have 1 to 2 locations. There are a handful that have between 5 and 10, and there are a couple that have 3 or 4. But the bulk of them are, I would say, are in the 1 to 4 space, and most of them are still working clinically. So it's great when I see them sharing their wisdom, on a Zoom call together, and they certainly do that when we get together for the workshops. One of the initiatives that I had for this quarter that I had to punt to next quarter is to create an online community. I didn't want to do it through Facebook, so I had to figure a different platform and kind of test it and all. And I'll be ready to probably roll that out probably in September, actually, to facilitate those connections between the community. And they also have access to me over the course of, whatever the quarter is. I have some dedicated one-on-one time with them at the end of the quarter, but I have a lot of the members that reach out to me and say, hey, I'm thinking about acquiring I got a prospectus from a broker. I'm thinking about acquiring a practice, and this is my first acquisition. Can you hop on a call and go through some of this with me? And so they have access to me, on a one-off basis as well. So I think there's a lot of collaboration, with the group, and they're such great people because they're so willing to share. Like, there are no egos in the group, and that just makes it really, really rewarding.
Yeah, I can only imagine what that synergy must look like. Do you have any success stories that highlight the transformation this program delivers yet, or is it still really early days?
I think it's still really early days. And I think, the transformation, in my prior life at Tusk and Polaris, I would say like the transformation would be quantifiable in terms of number of locations, EBITDA, valuation, exit, or whatever. I think being a coaching program, this is really more of a qualifiable, if that's even a word, type of a transformation where somebody feels like they spend, up to a year or more with me, and they learn a lot about how the business fits together. They're able to start to drive results. They sort of prove it to themselves. I do get feedback that, hey, what you told me, it actually worked. I get some of that from time to time. But I think the confidence level that you see people start to blossom, the thing about healthcare practice owners is that, like, you and I have worked in a corporate environment, and regardless of what we were doing or what level we came into the organization, we always had somebody above us to not only mentor us, but we could emulate what they were doing. Like, you could see how leadership at their level was different than what we were doing at our level. And when you're able to kind of look up the food chain and see that, it allows you to take some of your own self-development upon yourself, right? In terms of professional development. I mean, if you're a dentist that buys his or her own practice at the age of 35, you are de facto the top of the food chain.
Yeah.
There's nothing above you. And so I think when we start talking about professional development from an executive and a leadership modeling standpoint, there's nothing that caters to that in this type of an environment. And I think that's a critical miss, because literally they're either making it up as they go along, or they don't know what they don't know. And trial and error is I think it's a problematic way to build a business, and it can short circuit a career. And usually a lot of it's avoidable. So, hopefully I'm an accelerant to that level of confidence that they gain over time.
Yeah, more gain, less pain,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
What do you see so far in your work, in terms of the number one leadership gap amongst practice owners today? What are you observing there?
Yeah, so I mean, I think it goes back to a little bit of what I talked about early on in my career, and that is the um the failure to understand that you can no longer outwork your problems, and that for you to be successful, you have to create greater results through others. Now, a lot of, in this case, dentists understand that if they hire associates, the associates are going to be doing a lot more clinical work. So they can relate to that. They understand that. But it's different when you start talking about, how to lead and develop people, be it at a clinical level, an operational level, a business development level, or anything else. Like, these are skill sets that are different from clinical skill sets. And so I think that, embracing a leadership role of creating results through others based on results that you've never, or activities that you've never actually done yourself. I mean, that's a point of anxiety. I had that early on in my career for sure. And so I think that's one of the things that ultimately people justifiably struggle with. And if we go back to what I was saying before, that how you communicate with people in a leadership context and how you earn the currency of trust, communicating can be over a Zoom video call. It can be in a company-wide address. It can be in a small department meeting. It can be one-on-one where you have to, correct some underperforming characteristics in somebody, things like that. Like, you, as a leader, you're always communicating something, and you cannot abdicate that responsibility. Most dentists are introverts, so they don't lean into that requirement of the role. And I'm introverted as well, believe it or not, but I can scale to that extroversion when I know I need to in a communication manner. And I think that you gotta get people out of their clinical shell and into a more leadership shell, and start to show them how that's done and what they need to expect of themselves in that role.
And given that, what role do you think emotional intelligence plays in building a sustainable
I
practice?
think it's critically important. I think emotional intelligence, it's a great question, and one that I don't know that I've gotten any time recently. So thanks for asking it. But emotional intelligence counts every bit for the team that you're leading, the staff that you have, as it does for your patients, as it does in a self-awareness context of how you evolve and change as a leader over time. We're not the same. You and I aren't the same leaders that we were when we were 30 or 35 or 40. We change a lot, sometimes around the dynamics of the business, but also based around the variables of life, and I think having that EQ is part of being relatable, part of generating that currency of trust, and also, having the confidence to deliver um, a message that's not grounded in positive outcome or assurance. And I think we find ourselves from a macro perspective in a very uncertain time. We're already in it, and I don't think that's going to get better before it gets worse. I think we've got a lot of headwinds, as a country, as a society, as a profession, all of it, right? I mean, these are challenging times. That the bull run cycle that we've been on is over, man. I mean, so, having
Hmm.
the emotional intelligence to relate to your people, the anxiety that they're carrying with them, the family dynamics around their spouse who might have just gotten laid off, or, whatever else it may be, to be able to embrace that, to be empathetic, to be able to look them in the eye and say, and tell them that, look, I'm not gonna paint a rosy picture for you. Things are gonna get tougher before they get easier, but I need your commitment. I'm here. I'm staying. We're gonna get through this. I don't know how long it's gonna be. I don't know what the outcome on the other end looks like, but we are going to get through it, and we're gonna be better off for it. We got some hard days ahead of us. And if you can communicate that type of a message, you know, concretely and empathetically to an audience, they will rally behind you. But you also can't wait to be asked of it. You got to be proactive. And I think that's important with where we find ourselves.
That's important, for how one talks to their practice. You're doing the same, really, at some level, as you're talking with clients and helping them go from clinician to CEO to owner, right? Helping them
Yeah.
transition. I would love to understand what you think needs to shift in the doctor's mindset for them to be able to make that transition from clinician to CEO to owner.
Yeah, those three roles are not the same, obviously. You can occupy all of them as a practice owner, but it does not mean that the roles are the same. And what I try to impress upon uh, the people that I have the opportunity to speak with, or lead in my program, are that transition from clinician to CEO is the first step as the business owner. And I talked about being a master at the craft to leading others who do the craft or who do things that support the craft, and creating greater results is the first step from being a clinician to an effective CEO for sure. And then there's the component around risk, not just risk variables in the business, but usually when I talk about risk, I'm talking about debt load. So, how are we methodically, as the CEO, building a business that is within our risk tolerance, and our workload and the requirements of all of it, and still being able to lead it effectively and know that we're not financially driving ourselves into the dirt. The transition from, or the adaptation of being a full-fledged entrepreneur and business owner is a different phase. And this is one that was one that I had to confront very recently in terms of my exit of Polaris, my prior company where I was co-founder of that, a very successful business. But, as business owners, we we're all driven individuals, right? We're all chasing something. We all have great ambitions. Usually those are financially related early on, but there's ego stroke to all of this, Kevin. I mean, there's the awards, the accolades, the money, power, pleasure, fame. There's all of that. That's the driver of every successful individual, until it starts to have diminishing returns. And I was not aware of any of this as little as 3 or 4 years ago, really. I just thought that I was in a midlife crisis and in a perpetual fight with myself. And, I was making more money and, all that. And it didn't mean as much. And you kind of get to that point where you say, wow, is this all there is? Right? I mean, you kind of get to that top of the mountain where you're looking around and you're like, I thought there'd be more there, right? I mean, have I done it all wrong? Like, holy cow. And so as an entrepreneur, you have to understand certainly your level of risk. You have to understand the journey that you're on, what you're really chasing, what you hope to create, but it cannot cannibalize your family or yourself in the process. And I've known a couple of people and worked with a few of them that have healthy 8-figure bank accounts with, a life in tatters around a divorce and kids who won't speak to them, and they have heart health issues. And that's not winning in my book, at least.
Yeah.
I mean, can you fly private? Can you buy a nicer car or have a second home? Yeah, but that has diminishing returns too. And so, when I start talking about ownership and entrepreneurship with my group, and we spend a good bit of time on this, it's really building a business that's congruent with the lifestyle that we want to lead and having it be a complement to that, knowing that it's never going to truly be in balance. But if we are building a healthy business and we have a healthy life around it and we protect ourselves from ourselves, and we're physically and mentally and emotionally and spiritually fit and everything like that, then why would you ever want to sell it? First and foremost, right? But that just feels like fulfillment. And that was, part of my driver in exiting the prior business for my needs that were more, Perrin, not financially driven or anything. And, my former co-founding partner is doing great with the company, but he's on a different journey that I am now. And this is one that I feel like I'm really entering into another phase of growth and entrepreneurship for me. And it's a really, really great place to be. And I would wish that for everyone, honestly. I would wish it for everyone.
Well, let's talk to the younger generation for a minute. For younger doctors, especially students, recent grads, maybe they're in some form of residency. What advice would you give them before they step into ownership or, maybe importantly, partnership with someone else?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so I when you come out of dental school or medical school, um, you have a tremendous skill set and an unbelievable opportunity ahead of you. Um, it really is a perspective of abundance that I have relative to that. If I go back to our early part of our conversation, and I would sort of play that refrain around mentorship again, and I would tell any of your younger audience to chase mentorship, not money, at least not right away. You want to become a more well-rounded clinician and human being and potential business partner and or owner. You're going to learn that at the knee of somebody who's done it. Just chasing it. Look, all of us, none of us do what we do for free. We all want to get paid. We all want to make some money. You've been in school a long time. I get it. But what you're going to find is that if you choose the right mentor, they're going to be an accelerant to your career, and it's going to yield financial outcomes at a much greater rate than whatever your initial signing bonus is elsewhere. So chase mentors, not money. The other thing is be willing to relocate to do it. I moved around, I think in the first 20 years of my career, like 6 or 7 times I figured out. And a lot of that was a bet on myself and a move for opportunity and chasing a bigger playing field that would give me more opportunity. Um, I could have never done that if I had stayed in my hometown in 1997 when I left, and it just wouldn't have happened, and so I think that kind of self-reliance at an early stage is critically important. And when you don't have a spouse or children that you have to make decisions for others, you can reconcile it with yourself. It does come with downsides. Don't get me wrong, but while you can, you owe it to yourself to kind of experience different parts of the United States, the world, if you will, to gain some different experiences, to broaden your network, to avail yourself of opportunities. and to really experiment a little bit. And what you find is that if you take the first maybe 5 to 10 years outside of your dental school, to be able to relocate to different cities, to work under other mentors, and to really broaden your horizons, you're going to be a more well-rounded person. And look, for a kid who grew up in Columbia, South Carolina, I lived 4 years in Manhattan, right? And it was an unbelievable experience for me that I take lessons from that, 15 years later, still to this day. And I'm grateful for all of those opportunities. And I'm also grateful that I was courageous enough to take those risks. So be willing to relocate, chase mentors, not money, and always be a lifelong learner, goes without saying.
Well, that's great advice. I'd like to bookend that maybe with some thoughts for practice owners right now who may be listening to this feeling stuck or, maybe otherwise overwhelmed by some business complexity or business issue. Do you have any final words for them?
Yeah, look, and I don't want this to sound too self-serving, but I've been stuck too. Okay. And we all hit ceilings of complexity where it gets frustrating, right? You feel like you just kind of wrapped around the axle, and dentistry specifically has a way of lending itself to Groundhog Day, where every day feels like yesterday and tomorrow's going to feel like today. And look, I get it, right? But when you find yourself hitting ceilings of complexity, you cannot think that that is unique to you, or that no one else has ever been there, done that, got the t-shirt, worked my way through it. You're just not talking to the right people. If you're the smartest person in the room, you need to find another room, right? And so
Great advice.
I have, especially in my entrepreneurial career, but even a little bit in corporate America, I've worked with a variety of different business coaches and a few counselors to help me navigate different phases of life and business, and that feeling stuck or in a box and not having a frame of reference. I was too close to the situation, right? I was part of the problem. I couldn't solve it on my own. And whether it's a counselor or a business coach or a group coaching program, I've been part of numerous ones. I work with a one-on-one business coach right now who has helped me to craft what became Next Level Executive. I work with a group called Strategic Coach out of Chicago, which is an entrepreneurial coaching group for 4 years that was instrumental early on in my entrepreneurial career. We worked with an EOS implementer in the business that was a coach that allowed us to implement frameworks and stuff to make the business hum along. Like, just none of us get through life at any level of success doing it on our own. Tiger Woods changed swing coaches 4 times through his epic run of however many, championships that was. And just to sit there and think, well, I'm stuck, and be kind of head in the sand about it. I hate to be harsh to your audience, but that's a you problem. There are people who've already solved what you're going through. You just hadn't found the right one, or you hadn't been willing to look for them yet.
Well, that's a great call to action, Perrin. Where can listeners learn more about the Next Level Executive?
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. The website is thenextlevelexecutive.com. I, of course, looked for the world's longest unclaimed URL when I wanted to start the company and found it. So it's thenextlevelexecutive.com. There, you can find out about me, about the program. There's links to some long-form essays that I write. There's thought leadership. There's a link to the podcast there. The podcast is called The Next Level Executive. And it's on, Apple, Spotify, all the major platforms as well. I talk about a lot of this stuff on my podcast. I'll have you on it before too much longer here. I speak at a handful of conferences, but, there's ample ways to find me on social media and everything else. And if if any of this reverberates with you in a positive way, you can book a call with me off my website as well. There's some link on that too. So plenty of information there. If you're having trouble falling asleep at night, the podcast's great for that too. So.
Well, I enjoy your podcast and I like your newsletter as well. So I'd love to connect with you. And I've been watching what you've been doing, watching what you've been putting out also on LinkedIn. So I really commend you for putting your content out there. I think there's a lot for folks to learn from you. Parents certainly wish you all success with that.
Thank you, Kevin.
I know you've heard this, given what we've talked about leading up to this episode, but we wrap every episode of Doc Secret with a lightning round. So these are quick answers. Are you ready?
I guess ready as I'll ever be. We'll see what comes out of this, but go for it.
Well, let's do it. Here we go. What is one leadership book that every dentist should read?
I would say a book called Who Not How by Dan Sullivan and Benjamin Hardy, Hardy. Dan Sullivan's the founder of that strategic coach program that I mentioned. All of us think about doing something and how to do it, but we should think about who knows how to do it, not how to do it.
Great. What is the biggest myth in dentistry business you wish people would stop believing?
This one's easy, that we're going to be 80% consolidated within 5 years and all working for private equity-backed groups. That is more than a myth. That's a fallacy.
You always mention red wine and strong coffee. If you could keep only one, which would it be?
Oh, coffee. 100%. I could give up booze and alcohol tomorrow, but caffeine I'd kill you for. So it's got to be coffee.
All right. What's the best advice you've ever received that still sticks with you?
Take care of the people who take care of you, and always leave things better than the way you found them. Those are two different things, but they're kind of part and parcel of the same philosophy. Take care of the people who take care of you, and always leave things better than the way you found them.
Great advice. What's one thing you wish private equity firms understood about dental practices?
They really can only unlock or create value and valuation improvement at a clinic level. You can't do it through an aggregation play alone. You have to have tools, talent, strategies, tactics to improve the practice that you bought. You can't just rely on an aggregation play.
A personal one here. If your daughter asks you why you love your work, what would you say?
Ooh, that's a good one too. I would say I love what I do because I feel like it's 100% me and my relationship to my members or my audience. Naval Ravikant has a great quote that he says, you escape competition through authenticity. And I hope that will one day be representative of Next Level Executive.
That's a great one. That's a great quote from a great thinker.
Yeah.
Perrin DesPortes, my friend, it has been an honor and a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining me here on this episode of Doc Secret. Really appreciate having you on.
Kevin, the honor was all mine. Believe me, I'm flattered that you would ask and allow me to ramble on for as long as we've been on together. So I'm grateful for it. I'm grateful to be with you, and I hope your audience found a few pearls of wisdom somewhere in there.
I'm sure they have. Thank you so much, Perrin. If you liked today's episode, please like and subscribe, and most importantly, share this podcast with others you think may benefit from the Doc Secrets shared here today. Thanks for joining us on today's episode, and we'll see you next time.